Hello and welcome to the Classics Capsule. My name's Sean McKiernan and today we are going to begin looking at a very expansive genre of film which has its roots in way back in the silent era of cinema. When cinema was first introduced, there were a number of different things, a number of different styles, all falling into very specific brackets. One bracket in particular was a branch from Italian films, and it started off really as a sort of huge sprawling biblical epics, which then, as silent films phased out and talkies came in, were then revisited. And probably the most famous one of the lot of these films, which was revisited and went on to a huge success, was a film that came out in 1959. It's a remake of a 1925 film, and it's based on a novel that was written in 1880 by Lew Wallace. And the name of the novel was Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ. Both the silent film and the 1959 remake cut out the extra bit of the title and just called themselves Ben-Hur. The film had a bit of a troubled development, really. It was first announced that it was going to be done in 1952. And Sidney Franklin was attached as director, and Stuart Granger was approached to play Ben-Hur, and he indicated that he was quite prepared to accept the role. As development went on, no filming was done on it. The script was being written, finance was being arranged, and by 1956 there was still no sign of the film actually being made. But then Sidney Franklin's health began to decline and he was forced to drop out of the project. And with no director, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer decided to drop the entire project completely. That was the end of it. Ben-Hur was not going to be made. By the end of the 1950s, MGM were in serious financial trouble and they were looking around for a film which could restore their glories. And they took inspiration from a film made by Paramount 3 years before about the Ten Commandments. And they thought that here was a big sprawling biblical epic made by Paramount that had been a massive financial success. Maybe we could do something very similar. And then it was recalled that they had actually started development on a remake of the 1925 version of Ben-Hur. So Ben-Hur was resurrected. The director for the sort of second attempt at making this film was a gentleman named William Wyler. He was a bit of an inspired choice in a very sort of unconventional way for the film, in that he'd been one of 40 assistant directors on the 1925 original silent film of the thing. He initially turned the project down. When he saw the script for the film, he described it as the worst hack writing he'd ever seen in his life. And he only agreed to make it because he was paid the highest salary for any director at the time. Now this set a tone for this film because it became an epic in more ways than one, not just in the actual scale of the film. The screenplay itself is credited to Carl Thunberg, but Carl Thunberg, while he wrote the vast majority of it, there were also major contributions from Maxwell Anderson, S.N. Burnham, Gore Vidal and Christopher Fry. It was very much a collaborative effort. The only writer credited on the film is Carl Thunberg. The budget was set for the film of $8 million, which for 1959 was an astronomical amount of money, especially for the film studios in serious trouble. Costumes started to be made, sets started to be made. It took 200 artists and fabricators to build the sets for this film. It took over 100 costume makers to make the costumes. The scale of this was just absolutely enormous. In terms of casting the film, the first choice that Wyler had to play Ben-Hur was Burt Lancaster. Burt Lancaster was a very, very devout Christian, and he turned the film down flat because he thought it was incredibly disrespectful towards Christ. And so he said a not very polite no thank you to it. After Lancaster passed on the thing, they went to an actor who at that time he was well known, but he was still very much up and coming and still sort of building his reputation. It was Paul Newman. And Paul Newman was interested in taking the role on until he was told what his costume was going to be, and he turned it down because he said, I haven't got the legs to wear a tunic. So, an actor who then indicated and expressed a major interest in the role was Kirk Douglas. Wyler had worked with Douglas in the past, and he kept the very much in the back of his mind, but rather than go to him, he then approached Rock Hudson, who said no. Marlon Brando was approached and passed on the thing, and Leslie Nielsen, of all people, who at that time was a very serious actor. It was only in later years, with the advent of the airplane films, that Nielsen began to demonstrate a very real talent for completely off-the-wall surreal comedy. He was known at the time as being a very dramatic actor, but he had absolutely no interest in doing something like this. Charlton Heston was approached to play the role of Messala, and he accepted the role of Messala. And the thought was that Kirk Douglas was then going to be a shoehorn for Ben-Hur because of his previous association with the director and because of his expressed interest in playing the role. But then William Wyler met an actor named Stephen Boyd, who he realised was absolutely perfect as Messala, which gave a problem because he already had Charlton Heston. But then when he made the decision about Stephen Boyd, he then thought that Heston would be the absolute ideal Ben-Hur. The role was offered to Charlton Heston, who, being the big star that he was, recognised that playing the title role of the film was going to massively increase his billing, so he snapped at the chance. This put Kirk Douglas's nose ever so slightly out of joint, which we'll come back to in a little while, because it had a major effect on a film that he then went on to develop. Stephen Boyd and Charlton Heston both had very pale blue eyes, and to get a contrast between the two of them, Wyler insisted that Boyd wore contact lenses to make his eyes look brown. Cast as Miriam originally was an actress named Marie Ney. When filming started, she started work and she was fired after 2 days because she was unable to cry on cue. With a gap in the film, or in the cast now, Heston suggested that they cast an actress named Martha Scott, who he'd worked with in the past. Wyler met her, thought she was absolutely perfect for the role, and so they cast her, went back, reshot all the film that had been done, everything went fine. The filming began on the 18th of May 1958 and ran right through until the 7th of January 1959. The cast being required to work up to 14 hours a day for 6 days a week. Such was the scale of the thing. It was feared that it was going to sink MGM. It would have gone one of two ways with the budget, the way it began to escalate. They finished up, they used 200 camels for the thing. They used 2,500 horses for the film. It was absolutely, the scale of it was just absolutely incredible. A massive sea battle, which was one of the biggest filmed at the time, was filmed on the backlot at MGM Studios in a huge water tank. For its time, and yeah, nowadays you watch it and you think, my God, that looks cheap and nasty. At the time, it didn't. It was incredibly spectacular. It was a vast sequence, along with what is still regarded as one of the greatest action sequences in any film, and that is the chariot race. This one sequence in the film, which it's on screen for a total of 9 minutes. It took a whole year to prepare. Charlton Heston and Stephen Boyd both learned how to drive chariots themselves so that they could make the film themselves. There were no stunt doubles for the two of them. They did the whole thing themselves. It was all filmed for real. The set itself was it was based around an old Jerusalem circus, and the pageant sequence in the thing, which William Wyler freely admitted is not historically accurate, is a shot-for-shot remake of the 1925 original, when the pageant features in virtually the exact same place in the film. Wyler only included the pageant in the 1959 version because he wanted to show the scale of the set that had been built, and he felt the best way to do this was to show this pageant, and rather than recreate the thing in his own way, he went back and just reshot the thing as it was originally, which was another nice tie-in to the original film. By the time the film had finished shooting and its post-production work had been completed, its budget had risen to $15.75 million. It was the highest budget for any film at the time, and when it was released, MGM were understandably very, very nervous. But their fears were completely ungrounded when the film went on to win 11 Academy Awards, which was a record at the time. It was a record that stood for many, many, many years. It became the second highest grossing film in cinema history at the time, second only to Gone with the Wind. It became the highest grossing film of 1959. And the footnote for the whole thing was that the fact that the director, who had been very reluctant to make it in the first place, at the Oscar ceremony, when one of the many awards it won was for Best Picture, at his speech when he accepted the award, he said, "It's ironic that it takes a Jew to make a decent film about Jesus Christ." Now, while Ben-Hur was being shot, the actor who had been very keen on playing Ben-Hur and being passed over for the role, Kirk Douglas, he decided he wanted to do a biblical epic of his own, very much along the same line of what would become known now as the sandals epics. And he was directed to read a novel by Howard Fast about a gladiator who led an uprising, and the gladiator's name was Spartacus. Douglas read the novel and he absolutely loved it, and he decided that he wanted to make a film about Spartacus. His own production company, named Didn Productions, obtained the rights to make the film, and he approached a writer named Dalton Trumbo to write a screenplay, which was a very controversial move because Dalton Trumbo was on the Hollywood blacklist at the time. Kirk Douglas did not agree with the blacklist at all. He just saw Trumbo as a major talent and an outstanding writer, and he wanted him to write the screenplay, so he was going to write the screenplay. And if that meant that this was going to be a very controversial film, he didn't care, because in Douglas's mind, there ain't no such thing as bad publicity. Trumbo's involvement actually had a very unexpected result, which we'll come to in a short while. In terms of getting finance for the film, Douglas found it quite difficult, because while the Ten Commandments had been a success and Ben-Hur was in production, it was with the sort of scale of the budget that Ben-Hur was known to be building up at that particular point in time, film studios were a bit reluctant to pile money into another sandals epic, particularly based around the same sort of time. To get around the fears, Kirk Douglas went and convinced Laurence Olivier, Peter Ustinov and Charles Lawton to appear in the film. At which point he then was able to go to Universal Pictures to point out to them that he had these three major stars agreeing to appear in the film. On the back of the involvement of these three actors, Universal agreed to back the film financially. There was then a major obstacle appeared when Yul Brynner announced that he was also developing a film of Spartacus. And it then became a race on who could actually get a script approved in time. And in this respect, Dalton Trumbo came up trumps. He completed a completed screenplay within 2 weeks, which Kirk Douglas liked. He signed the thing off. It went to Universal and they signed it off. And once Yul Brynner realised that he'd lost the race, he quite graciously abandoned his own plans for a Spartacus film and gave Kirk Douglas a free rein on it. The director that was eventually attached to the film was quite a surprising choice, really. He was known mainly for doing sort of quite low budget westerns, and it wasn't really Kirk Douglas's choice. Kirk Douglas wanted David Lean to direct the film, and David Lean had absolutely no interest in it, and so another director was needed. The director that was chosen was Anthony Mann, and he only managed to film the opening sequence of the film, which took a whole week to complete. Kirk Douglas was very, very worried that man, in Douglas's own words, man seemed to be terrified of the scale of the film, and so he had him removed from the production. Now, Douglas's view is quite strange, because the following year Anthony Mann went on to have a huge success in a film called El Cid, which is, if anything, of a bigger scale than Spartacus, but there you go. Mann's replacement was a very surprising choice, really, it was Stanley Kubrick. And Kubrick agreed to do the film, but he wasn't a happy man when he was making it. He was not allowed anything like the control that he would normally have in the films that he made. And he caused uproar on the set, particularly with the director of cinematography, because Kubrick, his style was, he was absolutely meticulous in what he wanted, and he would instruct the director of cinematography exactly what to shoot, which was the director of cinematography's own job, really. The cinematographer for Spartacus was a gentleman named Russell Metty, and they clashed continually, which resulted in Kubrick coming out with the comment to Metty of, "You can do your job sitting in a chair and shutting up, and I'll be the director of photography." Metty then agreed to go along with whatever Kubrick wanted, but he continued his protests about Kubrick's style, and he continued his protests until the film won an Oscar for Best Cinematography, at which point Russell Metty shut up about his criticisms about Kubrick and his methods with making the film. Now, most of the cast, as I said, were already in place. Laurence Olivier plays Crassus. Peter Ustinov plays Lentulus Batius in an absolutely wonderful performance. Ustinov was a wonderful actor at staying just the right side of going too far over the top and going just edging up to going just to the edge of acceptability with what was camp and what wasn't. He is absolutely brilliant in this film, and quite deservedly won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor for it. Gene Simmons was cast as Verinia. Charles Lawton plays Sentonius Grailus. Anthony Curtis as Antonius. Cast as Julius Caesar is an actor named John Gavin, who this will be expanded on in a later edition of the capsule. All I'll say about John Gavin at the moment is that 10 years after Spartacus was made, he was offered and accepted the role of James Bond. That will be expanded on when the Bond films are looked at. The film was released in 1960, and it was quite controversial for quite a bit of its content, an awful lot of which was also cut out, including one infamous scene set in one of the bathhouses at the time. The scene had actually been excised, which is where its sort of fame came from, if you like. It was known that this scene had been shot, and it was taken out of the film because of its content, and because at the time homosexuality wasn't really something that you saw on screen, and it was very heavily hinted at in this particular sequence. It was thought that this sequence, having been excised, was then destroyed. However, in later years, when Spartacus was restored, as part of the restoration work, this scene was rediscovered and was then reinserted into the film, so that the film then became known as the complete version of Spartacus. In total, the film won 4 Academy Awards, and it became the biggest moneymaker for Universal in the studio's history. And it was a record that it held for 10 years until, of all things, Airport usurped it and made more money than it. As to how a film like Airport could make more money than a film like Spartacus is anyone's guess. Like Ben-Hur, the two films are just... The scale of them is incredible. The camera work, everything is just absolutely fantastic. The sad thing with Spartacus was that Kubrick went on to completely disown the film. It was the only film that he made where he did not have total editorial and artistic control, and certainly in the post-production there were things taken out of the film that he wanted kept in. He didn't have the control to keep them in. He had no interest in the film whatsoever once it had been made, and he very rarely, if ever, spoke about it for the rest of his career. It's a great shame, because it is actually one of the best films that he made, but it wasn't a film that he had developed himself. It wasn't a film that he had had a hand in writing, producing or anything. He just came on as the director. Now, at this point there has to be a very, very honourable mention for a film which is just an absolute all-time classic. It came out 3 years after Spartacus, and it is very much a sandals epic, but it adds another element in that it becomes a swords, sand and sandals epic. And rather than use the Bible as its inspiration, it uses Greek mythology. And at this point I have to make an even more honourable mention for a young lady who I was introduced to yesterday, named Kirsten, who informed me that she has never heard of Ben-Hur or this next film that I'm going to touch on, which is Jason and the Argonauts. One of the greatest films ever made. I don't care what anybody says, this film is an all-time classic. It's made by an absolute genius of an effects maker named Ray Harryhausen. Now, the Harryhausen films are going to be looked at in more depth in a later edition of the capsule, so I'm not going to go into any great detail about Jason and the Argonauts here, and a lot of this will be repeated when the Harryhausen capsule is compiled and recorded. The Jason and the Argonauts was produced by Charles H. Schneer and directed by Don Chaffee, distributed by Columbia. Harryhausen was he was a specialist in film special effects, and in particular a technique known as stop motion animation, where a model will be shot for one frame and then will be very minutely moved and photographed again for another frame, and so on, until when the whole sequence is put together it looks like these models are moving. Entire sequences were put together with this and mixed in with live action. And like Ben-Hur with its chariot race, like one of the greatest sequences in film history, the same has to be said of a almighty pitched battle between Jason and the Argonauts and some skeletons. in a huge, what amounts to a gladiatorial duel between these 7 skeletons and the Argonauts. An awful lot of the effects. This was a time before blue screen technology was known, so a lot of the effects were done very much by the use of camera trickery and forced perspectives. Again, a technique that Harryhausen was an absolute master in. Best seen in the, again, an absolutely incredible sequence for the time. And you look back on this film now, it's nearly 60 years old, and you look back on it and you think, nah, this just looks naff. By today's technology, yes it does. But sequences where you get Poseidon rising out the water, where you see the Argonaut ship sailing through between 2 mountain ranges with these huge monsters blocking the path. They're just such incredible images, which at the time were actually shot for real, live action, just simply using different camera angles and then mixing the 2 shots together. It is an absolutely incredible film for the time, and even today it still stands up as a fantastically entertaining piece of cinema. It's forever on television, you can't miss it. If you've never seen it, if you are one of the very rare people who have never seen Jason and the Argonauts or have never heard of it, look it up on Netflix, look it up on YouTube. Next time it's on television, watch it. It's on television virtually every single Christmas and has been for at least the last 45 years. Anytime it's on, I still sit down and watch it. I still find it entertaining. I must have watched it well over 100 times. It has a largely British cast. The only non-Brit in it, ironically enough, is the actor who plays Jason. He's played by an actor named Todd Armstrong, who he does give a very good performance, but he couldn't actually do an English accent. He had a very, very strong American accent, and his accent stood out like a sore thumb because everybody else in the film were all British. So, unfortunately for Armstrong, his dialogue was all dubbed by an actor named Tim Turner, although that is not actually credited in the end credits. It is purely and simply Todd Armstrong's performance. You have artists like Honor Blackman, very well known from a British television series called The Avengers, and who has had a major success in the cinema at that point in trying to steal Fort Knox and kill James Bond in Goldfinger, in what is on the face of it a very small part of the goddess Hera. And on the most part, you only really see her face when the figurehead of the Argonaut ship comes to life, and she's only in it sort of like 2 or 3 times, where she drops vague hints and little pieces of advice to Jason on what he needs to do, where he needs to go. But he does play fast and loose with Greek mythology. An awful lot of it is sort of played with. An example, going back to the sequence with the skeletons, the Greek mythology states that only one of the Argonauts is killed in that battle, when the film actually depicts 3 of them are. But, you know, one dying isn't really enough of a spectacle for a big epic film. You kill more of them, it makes Jason look more heroic, especially when he's smashing the skeletons up quite freely with his own sword. Honourable mention in the film to an actor, he is a favourite actor of mine, I make no secret of the fact. Again, it's a very small role, but he is brilliant. Patrick Troughton as the blind man Phineas, who is terrorised by a group of harpies, and who are captured by Jason and the Argonauts, and in return Phineas directs Jason on the path he needs to take to find the Golden Fleece, which is what the entire film is about. Again, that is another sequence which varies from what Greek mythology says. In the film, the harpies are caged. Greek mythology, the stories, they're actually just chased away in such a manner that they are convinced never to return, and they allow Phineas to live the rest of his life in peace. As I say, that film will be looked at in more depth, along with films about a very famous sailor named Sinbad, and another almighty sand, sword and sandals epic named Clash of the Titans, which again will be touched on in another edition of the capsule when we revisit the Sand and Sandals epic. It's not really a genre that can be looked at in one. The films are so epic, they are of such different sort of styles, different stories. They began life spawned really from the biblical epics of the 1920s that carried on into the 1950s and 1960s. They evolved through the 70s and the 80s into films such as Conan the Barbarian, Beastmaster, Hawk the Slayer. The effect of those films and how they differ from the beginnings of the genre will be looked at in a future edition of the capsule when the Sand and Sandals epics are revisited. In the meantime, I really do hope that you have enjoyed this edition of the capsule as much as I enjoyed putting it together. It's taken a long time to compile this particular one, and I have a funny feeling that the next one, the editions looking at these style of films, are going to be just as involved and just as problematic in putting them together as they were in actually making the films themselves. As always, please leave any comments that you have on the Facebook page, on the YouTube channel, or in the cloud. And in the meantime, this is Sean McKeon signing out of the capsule. Until next time.